Morrow of the Golden Age, Chapter 33. The Roman nobility, whipped into a terror of the so-called savage steppe peoples, watched from their fleeing boats as Eltinum fell. The Bosporans had crossed the Alps. An army of 40,000 had been torn up and planted as the seed of the new mountain at the pass, and the roads and bridges of Italia ground and trembled as the world itself exercised its new power. In this chapter, I have the privilege of telling you how the Bosporan alliance made sure that the Roman scheme to bow and diminish humanity was cast away from our history as if it was the Platonic ideal of folly. It was already time for the final harvest of 148 prior when Doreus and Zeusis led their victorious men into Eltinum, so it was decided that the main army could winter here in order to gain ample supplies for the grand campaign into Italia for the whole of the year to come. In addition, Phocas and the second portion of the Gold Guard advanced from Serdica in the east, securing the faster supply routes through Illyria with ease, as all Roman resistance had been melted away by the Battle of the New Mountain. The Romans did attempt an attack in the winter, but it was truly desperate. Some regrouped remains of their field army had clustered around a new force arriving by sea. This was the 14th Legion from Libya, arriving late for the muster at Eltinum, and finding that their punishment for tarrying was to be charged with disrupting the Bosporan presence there however they could. And I shall tell you they could not. This army consisted only of levied subjects, armed with spears, shields, and almost nothing else, down to a lack of clothing. These were desert men, effectively kidnapped for the purposes of this war, forced to abandon the horses that made them formidable soldiers. Naturally, they resorted to terrorizing the Roman people for supplies and shelter, practically forcing even loyalist holdouts to turn to Doreus for rescue. The Gold Guard went out into the countryside, and one Praetor Morrow of the Romans rallied the Libyans together for a pitched battle. It was absolutely one-sided, and the Libyans fled without having given much account of themselves. I should expect no different. Morrow's account was clear enough though. He remained on the field and let his horse join the rout, taking up the sword and falling amid the oncoming rush of Gold Guards. Hearing of such things makes one wish well even of a Roman, and pray that their wish, be it to attain honour or escape despair, be always granted in ways so fortuitous to the fate of those still living. With his efforts wasted, the invasion force was emboldened, and preparations to drive into Italia were seen to with the zeal of a hungry man placing meat into his cooking pot. I wrote already of the final departure of witness Aeneas, and the magnitude of his wake kept no secrets from the Romans in Macedonia. Seeing this, the local garrison forces came together into an impromptu legion and marched on Serdica, even during the winter. Since the city was in the highlands, this was a harsh prospect. They valued haste above all else, and wrongly so. The Bosporans were not wanting for leadership or discipline without Aeneas. On the contrary, the soldiery were pulling at their leashes to enter battle, wishing to show their own prowess and earn their place among the stars. Furthermore, they were now commanded by a fresh young officer from Apollon by the name of Aesop, the same Aesop who would become king many years after the closing of this chronicle, inheriting the position as younger brother of Cineas, heir to Aristippus, heir to Doreus, and famous for being the final king to rise to this rank by the old Bosporan succession order. But that is all for a future work. In 148 prior, he was a mere well-intentioned lad who was thrust into battle almost as soon as he arrived to chair the army. He was athletic and renowned for his prowess with a bow, a reputation earned on ritual hunts around Old Dacia, and hence he had a certain sense of lethal strategy that served him well now. Here is what he did. He went out of his fortifications at Serdica and met the Romans on the road as soon as possible. The Romans had no scouts, so this was a shock to them. The two armies lined up, and it became clear that the Bosporans had the advantage in numbers. This was because Aesop had brought with him an honour guard of 100 horsemen and 800 footmen, all trained to the highest degree, and armed with the masterful Persian gear being imported to the region for use by the Gold Guard. This honour guard was placed directly in the Romans' path, and then the main army, a mix of men from all over the empire with light equipment but tested skills, fanned out to either flank. The Romans did what Romans always do. They ploughed into the nearmost obstacle without care, trusting that when their officers told them they could defeat any foe, this was no mere rhetorical guide. So then the Roman infantry, heavily armed yet slow and uncoordinated, pressed into the prince's honour guard. The footfalls of thousands of men sounded all around them. Within hardly one circulation of the fighting line, the Romans were made to fight in all directions. With no horsemen and no sign that their enemy had been at all weakened, their cause was crushed in short order. Aesop was not very interested in killing the Romans once they had been trapped, preferring to make prizes of them. A consummate hunter he was indeed. In the coming spring, he took the men he captured and toured the nearby region to ransom the men back to their families, earning not only large sums of money, but winning over the hearts of the oppressed Macedonians, mountain tribes, and Illyrians. The city of Bilazora invited Aesop to be their governor, and he accepted, finding the offices of their prior Roman stooge thoroughly cleared of all Italian ornaments by the time he arrived. This was indicative of the general mood in Greece too, and so while the Romans counted hundreds of cities as their own in this region, they were teetering on the edge of rebellion or supplication to Rome's noble enemy. Hence Aesop and his men were to be spared the swirling vicissitudes of war, for no further warring seemed to be necessary or prudent to either side. But that insight was not shared by others across the Roman world, nor those who wished to plunge their picks into said world to be enriched by its innards. I will finally tell you what Dion did when news of war uprooted the armies of Egypt. He had committed himself to serve the Ptolemies in any such war, and duly attended the muster in Cyrenaica. We have already heard of what became of Rome's Libyan legion, and the Ptolemies were more than ready to snatch what they could while fruits hung so low along their border. In the autumn of 148 prior, tens of thousands of men set out in various directions. Prince Dion marched along the coast, kept supplied by sea, and moving essentially as a rearguard to the main force. This was because the Ptolemies strongly and correctly suspected Dion of attending the war only to further his own aims, or those of his family. It was the former more than the latter. At first, the caution of his contractual masters had him in check, so he performed as a perfect vassal, following orders as if they had been his very own will. Under a general named Euphanes, he aided in staking claims all along the Libyan coast and the Roman parts of Cyrenaica, until they came to the Roman colony at Machamedes. Here was a walled port used for military affairs, and as such it remained quite heavily garrisoned, with thousands of men manning walls high enough to obscure any view of the town. Euphanes prepared a siege camp here, and 3 months later, preparations for an assault were complete. It took this long because the siege materials had to be brought by ship, since the coastline west of Cyrenaica endures a stretch of a barren nature before finally becoming verdant again as it curves into the western waters of the inner sea. In an episode that runs parallel to Dion's earliest battles at Tyre, he was made to watch as wine-mad Alexandrians conducted their battle plans with an innocence laced in evil. Euphanes had many ladders and towers to bring up against the eastern wall. However, the Romans were watching at all times, and they were ready to receive all comers. Dion watched as thousands of troops braved arrows, fire, javelins, and stones to heave their engines to the wall. While they did reach their destination, the cost was comical. Dion thankfully was given leave to attack elsewhere, which he did cautiously, watching for signs of what fate he would be painting upon his men were he actually to surmount the wall and enter the Roman lair. In particular, he had riders all along the coast bringing him reports of Euphanes' grand strategy at sea, for the man was not so ludicrous as to throw his men against precisely the place where the Romans wished to fight without some gambit to tilt off inevitable defeat. And that gambit was the fleet, whose triremes raced for the port in escort of a full 4,000 warriors on slower craft. The Roman fleet was tiny, perhaps 5 ships in all, so it seemed that the waterfront could be taken from the water itself, and hence the city would be bundled up between the Ptolemaic and Bosporan troops fully. In classical Ptolemaic style, this plan was to fail dismally no matter the bolt of wisdom at its core. The fleet proved entirely unable to navigate the tides of the harbour, and so was made to approach in groups of 3 or 4 ships at a time. Now that Roman fleet of 5 ships seemed far more formidable. The Ptolemaic rowers were attempting to bypass the fight and crash into the harbour, planning to abandon their craft. Sometimes this was successful, but more often they were crashed into themselves by the prows of the Roman cutters. Hundreds of men were sunk into the harbour, their craft only further blockading the way for the rest of the fleet. And this went on for many iterations. Dion says that 1 in 4 ships actually deposited men on the docks, and that no ships at all went unsunk by day's end. It seems the Roman sailors are to be credited somewhat, but more so it is the Egyptian sailors that should be discredited. With all that seen and relayed to Dion, the prince ultimately committed to battle, because now that Ptolemaic men were in the city, the risk to his own men was diminished. He used his own ladders and towers to vault the walls without contest, and went straight to the government compound. He captured the Roman leaders and cut off the remainder of the troops. He did this so quickly that when the Ptolemaic men from the ships also arrived, they mistook Dion's men for the Roman garrison. Alas, the Bosporans had moved from rear guard to the foremost point of the van once more, and it was Dion standing on the steps of the temples to greet his allies, not anyone from the Ptolemaic army. They did arrive later, bloodied beyond all reason by their efforts to enter the city, and were at least relieved to see that the well-fortified inner citadels of the city had all surrendered to Dion. The city was annexed to the Ptolemaic Empire only once Dion had negotiated personal control of the ports, after which he had his men leave the city. Dion's enterprise was once again served by his so-called liege, forcing upon the Ptolemies compassionate behaviour towards their wards. That is how many people tell it, I have found. If Dion is to be believed, then it was all for the sake of money, but we have seen from his work in Hierosolyma that he was more aware of the methods of creating a golden age than he was willing to admit. I think it could be that he considered his elite education in privileged knowledge of the world to be at odds with his wish to be compensated for the alienation from power his line of the family had been made to go through. This was not taken very seriously. On the topic of family, it was at this same time that a man named Arcadios, who was the youngest son of the late witness Diotrephes, came to link the Spartacid line to the Seleucid one. Arcadios became the head of the Seleucid house through the robust marriage of his own family line into what remained at the Seleucid core, although this is often a wellspring of confusion because there was another man by the same name, Arcadios Seleucid, who was regent for a young child named Arcadios Yeman Seleucid, who is sometimes called the legal head of the house through succession conditions established in treaties with the settled peoples of Arabia. Since those were invalidated by the supplication of House Seleucid to Dorius, this is all unworthy of consideration. It was Arcadios Spartacid who came to lead this still wealthy family, and a Spartacid he was fondly recalled to be once his position of power became well known. He had not used the name beforehand because his father's adoption into the Spartacid house was not considered very legitimate. Now though, it was too valuable to discard, and Diotrephes was enshrined as a son of the late King Pyrrhosiades, having his rank of witness revoked from certain memorials because royal scions were not permitted to hold this rank, or rather they were presumed to outrank the post. This is not important to understand in the grand scheme, but if you seek to deepen your understanding of the Bosporan-Roman War, you will find various references to Seleucid men storming islands in the Aegean Sea. This was all by virtue of Arcadios' newfound wealth being put towards the good cause of the Spartacids. But other battles were far more important, so I will move my focus henceforth to the force under the king. With the entire Gold Guard now billeted at Altinum, the invasion of Italia was nigh. The original plan was to push forwards at the soonest opportunity. This was scuppered by the appearance of more Romans. A pair of men named Gracchus and Lentulus had been given leave by the Roman Senate to pilfer all the best men from the garrisons of the peninsula to form 3 new legions, likely below the usual size. This army came north to the city of Patavium, where preparations were being made for the Bosporan attack, since it was the nearest major city to Altinum. Instead, Gracchus and Lentulus stripped the men away from their work and went on the offensive. They found the Gold Guard, both of Zeusis and Phocas, encamped together in a large fort that sprawled out over the road at a strategic point so as to command it completely. Reaching Altinum would not be possible, and so the Romans prepared to besiege and capture this camp. King Dorius had no issue allowing them to delay his own campaign in this standoff, because the Lithosis contingent of the army did not need the road to make their way into the enemy's lands. Hence he took his men via circuitous routes into the mountains to avoid detection and appeared 10 days later amid the line of supply from Patavium to the Roman army. Thus imperiled, The Romans decided to press an attack against the Bosporan camp while the famous Lithosis were absent, and before their scant rations were all gone. This, as my hand never grows tired of writing, was another disaster for Rome. All of their men went together to tear down the Bosporan palisades, and were encouraged to see that little in the way of projectiles were offered to stop this. Soon the entire western and northern reaches of the fort were laid low by hook and rope. But what was within this box they were trying so hard to pry open? Lines of Gold Guard, 10 men deep, who stepped out with rested sword arms to face those who had been exhausted to open what was not actually a breach into the Bosporan camp, but merely a new gate for the Bosporans to more easily march out. This was by no means some total trump that ended the battle. Instead, it was merely a fine way to begin a long and drawn-out clash of heavily armed, hard-to-kill soldiers. A long day of battle saw the Bosporans pushing the Romans back from the ruined palisades cut by cut. If one extends their arms and then brings them together to perform a clapping motion with arms still outstretched, one can get an idea of how the battle lines were folded together. At first, the Bosporans were fighting in many directions against the Romans. Yet later the Romans had been kneaded together so that their line was shorter than their numbers would ordinarily allow. The Gold Guard were relentless in their pushing to achieve this, requiring little coordination to do so, while the Romans had no such coordination to slip out of the Bosporan press and resume their earlier position of advantage. I think an ordinary field legion might have achieved this, given the standards of training they were held to. This battle was not one-sided, and it is said that Gracchus led countless charges against a single point in the middle of the Bosporan line to try and break through. This caused the 10-rank formation to deplete to only 5 ranks, far more than normal men are willing to witness without breaking. But the Gold Guards had been instructed on how to be better than normal men, and furthermore understood the importance of death to a stage that it engaged their altruistic natures such that it might be happily given over for the good of all. Thus the Romans damaged their cause even as they slew opponents, ignorant of all the important details, of course. But the hopelessness of the battle was eventually made evident, so the Romans withdrew through the remaining side of their formation still open for mass movement. Neither side was well suited to a running battle, yet you were likely thinking of the thousands of horsemen already grazing on the fields between the Roman field army and their safest redoubts at Patavium. The Romans only thought of such blockades when they came upon them, or more accurately, when arrows came upon the Romans with shocking speed and hunger. The Lithosis had captured ample stores of steel-tipped arrows, well suited to killing mailed men. Indeed, many Romans threw off their armour to have better hope of escape, and that was a wise thing to do. Alas, the folly of the overall course of the day drowned any sudden bursts of ingenuity that might have arisen now. The Romans were killed for 2 days as they went this way and that, fleeing from approaching Gold Guard banners, and hoping every hill or tree line would be their shield against the constant horseback raids. Never was it, for elite riders of worldly power were as likely to use such terrain to their own benefit. The steady march of the gold standards stepped over 10,000 more Roman bodies, and hopeless Patavium surrendered when the first glint of those standards came into their view. From this base, the Italia campaign would begin in earnest, and this campaign was to be less a case of Bosporan advance than a case of Roman flight, for every measure had failed and every precaution been wasted in their truth-pierced state. And to speak of flight invites no better example than that of the dictator Servius Atellus. His seat in Rome was abandoned, to the approval of their Senate, who inherited that seat's power while it was not filled. Being most highly placed, Atellus had better access to information on the military threat Rome faced than anyone else, and it is telling that he thus fled first and furthest. Ships slipped away from Italia to carry him south, towards his old killing grounds in fallen Carthage, and then on to the grand Roman citadel known as Leptis Magna. This name translates from the Latin tongue into something like "you can be great," a twisted message to the survivors of the once truly great empire that regulated the Libyan coast. Atellus entered the harbour undetected. He was aided by the ever-present cloud of ships around the city, who were made to anchor there and wait for the small dock to become available. Thus, even though he arrived with many escort craft, it wasn't obvious to those watching the seas that anything significant had changed. But Attalus could not keep his secret for long, since the Ptolemaic army had already progressed along the coast to the point that enterprising city folk could comfortably journey out to sell information on military affairs, and hence the magnitude of the opportunity at hand became known to Prince Dion. It took him merely the phrase, "Their king can be our treasure," to convince his allies to begin preparations for a forward march. The only point of contention was that the Ptolemies wanted to wait for another fleet to come and support their attack, but Dion enraptured them out of that requirement, perhaps saving the lives of countless allied men. This was not enough to seize Attalus, and so he took the additional measure of sending out a party of men to capture the coast road west of the city. Ordinarily, the army of several thousand Romans at Leptis Magna would crush any such attempt. However, Dion used a curious detachment of what you might call desert lithoses. These were men he had recruited from Aravia, and drilled in the style that Darius had drilled into his younger cousin during the Seleucid War, that is, the lithosis style of horseback archery, spearmanship, and in particular the use of many small horses for every warrior. So while they were not at all attuned to the proper ordering of the world, they were a good imitation of such men. After all, good men of today are only imitations of the paragons of old. A band of 300 such men traversed the southern deserts with impossible ease in order to establish a checkpoint in the west. From there, they took care to inspect all travellers for any sign of the slippery dictator or likely associates. In the meantime, the combined allied army marched upon the citadel's walls, bringing up as much of the siege equipment from Machamedes as their supply of wagons allowed for. While we cannot know if Attalus wished to flee when he saw what was coming, he must have heard that a strange group of desert folk were looking for him personally on the road, and that every merchant stuck waiting in the tiny harbour would stand to profit immensely from taking his money for secret passage, then the Bosporan's money for a quick betrayal and delivery into custody. So it was to be battle for him instead, and I suspect he wished that he had the city of Rome as his shield and not this frontier garrison. Although in truth, Leptis Magna was a formidable citadel with 2 layers of thick stone walls impervious to rams, and a population made up almost entirely of trained soldiers. Therefore, it was wrong to call this a trap to begin with. Only in defeat would it be so, and so the allies came to bring this about. To demonstrate his full command of the situation, Dion utilized a cruelly cunning strategy, in which he was able to play his usual part in the battles of the Ptolemies, that of a bystander. He laid his army out in battle formation before the southern wall of the citadel, and as expected, the walls came to be lined with Romans. Now, nothing at all happened. Dion's men had been equipped with the traditional white-faced shields of old Chersonesus during their garrison duties in Persia, and these were favoured greatly by men in the field because they were excellent reflectors of heat. Therefore, by propping shields against spears, the Bosporan infantrymen were able to sit down and look upon the sweltering Romans from the shade. The Romans had no such luxury. Any time they stepped down from the wall, the Bosporans would spring up and brandish ladders, at which the Romans would be recalled. In this way, a portion of the Roman army was defeated in effect by having them waste the entire day watching Dion's every move. Nearby, the Ptolemies, with a limited force, were trying to break open the western gate. Those men the Romans could spare went to resist, yet Dion's display had been distraction enough that the gate was battered to pieces before the Romans could prepare oils or tar to repel siege engines. A brutal battle was made in the gatehouse. Euphanes was among the slain, after an attempt at using captured elephants to ram through the Roman shields inside the gate became entirely reversed, and it seems the beasts did not listen to Euphanes' protestations when he ran up to soothe them. Courage enough remained that the fight still proceeded, prolonged by the narrowness of the gate, because men could take short turns in combat, then rest for a long period. In the afternoon, Dion's horsemen came in from their checkpoint and realized that there was a small gate in the wall where it met the sea at the northwestern tip of the harbour. Snapping up this opportunity, a group of 100 or so men went and pilfered the sheltered battering ram the Ptolemies had let rest beside their place of battle. They tied their horses, 3 for each man, to its front, and towed it thus with stupendous speed, like it was the chariot of a gigas. In this way, the rams' movement to the overlooked gate was done by the time the Romans realized the threat. They thinned their numbers to get a few hundred men to go and cross the gateway with shields, finding the gate already splintering open in resounding cracks that forced the soldiers to raise their shields against the splinters. And when the gaps in the gate were large, the horsemen outside reached for their many packed quivers. Splinters of more deadly refinement sang through the breaches, while a few men used short axes to finish removing the gates in detail. This gate was so small that hardly 4 men abreast could traverse the tunnel through the wall. But when just 2 men rode through, their horses growling fiercely, the 100 men assigned to guard the road beyond were scattered away like they'd never seen a horse in their lives. Perhaps they had never seen a horse whose spirit was so webbed with man and earth in union. It was only a momentary lapse, which proved 1 moment too long. Hundreds more men came through and let fly arrows and spears, and hence the gateway was lost to these sly invaders. The nearby Romans fled and gave free passage to those storming into the docklands. The rest of the mounted troops came to exploit this prize further, and soon hundreds of men were riding about the citadel interior with hardly a raised voice to challenge them. By now, Dion had caught word that his men were attempting to enter the city, and he saw that the plan had worked from the reaction of the Romans on the wall in front of him. Seeing their panic and obsession with whatever was happening behind them, he at last gave the order for ladders to be set against the walls. Quickly, a large section was secured, and more gates were opened. The Romans gave way into a general retreat, rushing back with decent order to line up for battle in the marketplace before the temple district. There, dictator Attalus himself was present to command the men, and the lines were made steadfastly. As of yet, the Romans had not suffered very many losses due to the limited scope of the fighting, so it was not a simple thing to dislodge their wall of shields once it was set in place. Gradually, all of the soldiers from the allied armies came to the marketplace and began to assail the shield wall. The Roman shields were tall enough to see off most attacks without much finesse from the wielder, and could be raised as a ceiling over the soldiers in the rear ranks so that javelins and arrows were rebuffed. Attacking men like this makes for difficult fighting, but it also comes with a measure of safety, because the Romans were like a phalanx that couldn't break forward to attack when the chance arose, nor were their short swords long enough to force a blow upon anyone able to take a step back from the front. You shall, I know, debate the merits of such things among yourselves, so I will simply tell you how the line was broken. 2 measures were used. First, the Ptolemies had recovered a handful of elephants, who were brought up to menace the very flank of the Romans, so it was hard for the men the elephants swiped at to dodge away. Soon a substantial amount of the shield wall had been twisted and surrounded at its edge. To remedy this, Attalus rode over and called to his men, reminding them of their many hours of training, of their superiority to all other soldiers, of the glory of the Roman Empire and its destiny to rule the best of men and cull the rest to calm the wrathful gods. It is not worth examining the details, being fallacious, and being cut short by a sudden journey of a thrown spear. The weapon flashed out from a group of Bosporan hoplites and unmounted Attalus with deadly force. The cries of those around him revealed his terminal fate to all instantly, and hence the Romans were spared not even 1 moment of dread or shock. The thrower of the spear is often said to have been Dion himself, although he never claims this. However, this may be because attacking sincerely orating officers during a fight is often seen as quite dishonourable among Greeks, and is almost never recorded to occur. That, I think, makes Dion an all the more likely perpetrator, and you'll see no judgment of his transgression from any in the Chariskos Academy. The battle ended here with the killing and enslaving of the Romans, since their position so deep in the citadel would make any escape impossible, even if the allies had 1/4 of the numbers to command. From captives taken and from civilians, Dion discovered his comrades' success in breaching Italia. He had the perfect celebratory gift. A letter with a ring-jeweled finger was sent on a fast craft to secretly traverse the Adriatic Sea and deliver the missive to Eltinum. It was addressed to Dion's son Zeuxis, who saw that despite all he had done so far to bring himself renown, he had yet to secure a similarly decisive achievement. Such a prize existed, and it was a prize called Rome. Since by then the pacification of the northern reaches was over, Zeuxis begged the lead for a push south at the end of summer, and Darius granted it. It was a very long way to Rome, Yet that was precisely what made it weak. The garrisons of Italia had already been defeated in the field, and a swift move might avoid the raising of replacements. In truth, the Romans had a shortage of coin due to prior levies and due to rich men taking their wealth away from the orbit of the hungering state treasury. It is actually the case, believe it or not, that I am practically done relaying to you the major action of this war. No battle matters as much as those laid out in my 2 most recent chapters. That being the case, I will dedicate the next chapter to the actions that brought the war to its rapid, if hardly comprehensive end, or to the point when, in the common tradition, the modern era of history begins.